So let's get to the point. How did the Soviet Union become a world power? Let's go back to the revolutions. The two revolutions in 1917. The first revolution in March of 1917 overthrew the Tsar and replaced the Tsar with what would well have been a constitutional government. These were the first shaky steps taken in March 1917 towards a constitutional government in Russia. This constitutional government was overthrown by the Bolsheviks in November of 1917. There is major evidence, which I have published, of U.S. involvement. Not on the side of the formation of a constitutional government, but on the side of the Bolsheviks. Not the March Revolution, but the November Revolution. Now, I've not got the whole story. I published what I have been able to unearth, and these are roughly the key points. In March 1917, at the time of the First Revolution, Lenin was in Switzerland and Trotsky was in New York. They were the two major operators in the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin returned to Russia with the aid of the German High Command. I reasonably suspect that the Kaiser did not know. The highest German official who knew about this was Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg from the, well-known perhaps in Germany, the Bethmann Hollweg banking family. Trotsky was in New York, a penniless immigrant apparently. He acquired $10,000 in gold. He acquired an American passport. He was put on a boat for Russia. The Canadian authorities pulled the boat into Halifax, Nova Scotia. They took off Trotsky and his party, locked them up as prisoners of war. There was immediate intervention from both London and Washington, and these documents are in the files. He was put back on the boat for Russia with apologies. Also on the boat were Lincoln Steffens, quite a well-known leftist in the United States, and Charles Crane of the Westinghouse Company. And Charles Crane was chairman of the Democratic Finance Committee at that time and a friend of Woodrow Wilson. And the book tells you what happened and how they met and talked on the boat. Also in July 1917, a Colonel William Boyce Thompson, who was the first permanent director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, formed a Red Cross mission to Russia. Now, Russia didn't want a Red Cross mission. And the Red Cross in Washington didn't want a mission going to Russia. But Thompson was a very influential gentleman. He financed it and organized it himself. The mission had nothing to do with either medicine or Red Cross. I've listed the members of the mission. Out of 30, only 6 were doctors. The rest were Wall Street lawyers and financiers. There were representatives from Chase Bank, National City Bank, and the rest of it. The mission was a political vehicle to give assistance to the Bolshevik Revolution in November. What was the assistance? Well, very briefly, Colonel Thompson himself said, and it was published in the Washington Post, which is an authoritative source at the time, that he gave $1 million to the Bolsheviks to help their revolution. That's Colonel Thompson, not me. There was intervention by American International Corporation, which was another vehicle based on Wall Street, in Washington to forestall any possible assistance to the enemies of Bolshevism. Further, you can find in the British Foreign Office files the fact that Thompson and Lamont of the Morgans went to see Prime Minister Lloyd George in England and changed in one meeting British policy from being anti-Bolshevik to being pro-Bolshevik. This information, I would point out, comes from the British War Cabinet papers, Thompson's own papers, and the State Department files. The documents are quite genuine. Now, in early 1918, the Bolsheviks held only a very small part of Russia. They held really just Moscow and Petrograd. They were fighting both the whites and the greens. Now, the history books don't tell you about the greens. They only tell you about the reds and the whites. There were 700,000 greens. And the greens were Bolsheviks who saw that Lenin and Trotsky had betrayed the revolution to capitalists, and this was pointed out in the Russian newspapers at the time. And the Greens, 700,000 strong, were fighting against the Bolsheviks with the whites. But what happened is that the Wall Street mission and its allies in the United States gave the Bolsheviks enough breathing space to be able to occupy Russia. Another point that fits in here is Guy Richard's latest book on the rescue of the Romanovs, in which he, I think, proves that the Tsar was not killed. This is a myth perpetuated by Britain and the United States in collusion with the Soviet Union, for reasons which he will point out. And so this high-level collusion between the Soviet Union, the United States, and other countries has gone on since 1917. Now, also according to the history books, at the time of the revolution and civil war in Russia, Russian industry was in ruins. This is nonsense. Russian industry was not destroyed except perhaps in Petrograd. It was idle. It was in what the Soviets call a state of technical preservation. What happened was that the middle class, the technicians and the managers, left Russia. They weren't Bolshevik. And the plants and the equipment were standing there idle, and the Bolshevik revolutionists had no means to get it into action. What happened was, in the 1920s, foreign companies, mainly American or German, and the German companies were affiliated with major American corporations, mostly. These companies went into Russia, and they gave technical assistance, or they took the foreign concessions, some 300 or 400 of them, and this got the Soviet Union off in economic development. This, of course, I've covered in the very first book I put out back in 1968. The period from 1917 to 1930, how very prominent firms like Westinghouse, General Electric, Ford Motor Company, Standard Oil, these firms, through concessions and technical assistance agreements, enabled the idle Russian industry to get restarted under the Soviets. There are two names which should not be forgotten from the 1920s. Averell Harriman, who was operating the Georgian manganese concession, and Armand Hammer, whose father, of course, Julius Hammer, was executive secretary of the Communist Party USA. That is something the Los Angeles Times never prints, but it's quite verifiable. So the Soviet Union, in that first decade, was enabled to survive and recuperate with the assistance of German and American firms. I would point out, to keep the text straight, that the State Department was not at fault, as I see it. It's quite clear from the files, as I have read them, that State Department officials could look ahead. They saw the possibility of war, like Korea and Vietnam, where the Soviets would supply the other side. They looked ahead and they say, no, stay out of the Soviet Union, let it find its own feet, and we should not help to build it up. By 1928, the Soviet Union, with Western assistance, had restored a 1913 output. And the Soviet planners began to think about the 5-year plans. Maybe a few of you will remember that back in 1930 in the United States, there was a great publicity about the great experiment in the Soviet Union, pulling up by the bootstraps, a model for Roosevelt's New Deal to copy. How a socialist society could do all kinds of wonderful things a free enterprise society could not do. How free enterprise was outmoded. And who was saying this? Well, we find socialist Norman Thomas, and we find Roosevelt. But we also find, for example, a Gerard Swope, a president of General Electric Corporation, and we find Bernard Baruch. For those men that I call the corporate socialists, who run large corporations, then and now, I submit, are betraying a free enterprise society. Now, the Soviets certainly acquired a massive capacity in the first and second 5-year plans. That's during the late 1920s and the whole decade of the 1930s. What has not been said historically is how they acquired this massive capacity. Simple common sense would tell you that a backward country just does not start to build modern steel mills and automobile plants. That's just common sense. The first 5-year plan was almost entirely built by foreign corporations. General Electric, Ford, DuPont, Koppers, Badger, Foster Wheeler, Universal Oil, Douglas Aircraft, Radio Corporation of America, Pratt & Whitney, Hercules Powder, United Engineering, McClintock and Marshall, McDonald Engineering, McKee Corporation, you name it. Amongst the large U.S. construction corporations, they were there in Russia between 1928 and the beginning of 1933. The plants they built in the first 5-year plan were far larger in capacity and far more technically advanced than they were building elsewhere in the world. And the second 5-year plan in Russia, although this does not come out, of course, in the official documents, was really bringing into production the